Some of this will be recap, but we thought a good starting point would just be to explain, where we're at in the overall process. If you go to the next slide for me, Bob. So in the overall timeline, we began this process in April of 2022. And so we've been working on this for over a year. We're completing what the MSBA calls their feasibility portion of their program, and their program dictates a feasibility portion that ends in schematic design and then moves on to the full building design portion and ends with construction. So this would be our 7th community forum, and we're preparing to submit the SD report. And the SD report would really be what defines the budget for the program for both the town, the voters to approve in November, and for the MSBA to participate in moving forward. The goal of that would be to approve in November so that the town can continue to move forward with design, which would target a start of construction in August of 2025. So moving on to the next slide. The MSBA has a very structured program to their feasibility, and we've covered this in previous forums, so I'll move through this fairly quickly. We completed the preliminary design program in December, and what that really is an opportunity to set the educational program for the town, assess the sites that should be considered within town, and narrow them down into several that should be studied further. And it also gives you the opportunity to really decide what's going to be in your building before you know where your building's going to be. The preferred schematic report, which is the second step of the process, was something that we completed in early March. And that's really something where we not only selected from the sites that were available what the final site for the building would be, but we also looked at multiple schemes for the building that would be displayed on that site. And most important in that step, the school committee had their process for dealing with the grade reconfiguration and making the decision that this would be a 2, 3, and 4 school, and they had a lengthy process where they evaluated that. Currently, we're in schematic design. So if the preliminary design is, what type of building do you want? And preferred schematic report is where do you want your building? Schematic design is what do you want your building to be? And so elements of the building are being studied. We're working with teachers as well as the district and the town to understand both the regulatory things that influence the building, what will go within the building, what the building will look like, and ultimately we're trying to determine what the building will cost so that we can set a total project budget, and that'll be the number that moves forward for the town to consider at town meeting. So next slide. Overall in the process, the ESBC has continued to try and have as much outreach as possible. We kicked off the project early in April. And we've had multiple forums throughout the process. We had, through both of the first 2 phases, we had 5 forums, and then we had an additional one in early April where we talked about the option that had moved forward. And here we are in our 7th forum today. In addition to this, there was a multiple meeting process where the school committee deliberated over the grade configuration, as well as a visioning process where the district, working with interested members of the community, formed a visioning team, and they talked about what the vision for this project would be with Hopkinton. All of this has fed into where we currently are, where we're meeting with teachers. We just had our 2nd round, or we're actually in the process of having our 2nd round with faculty and staff to confirm the layouts based on what we heard from them in April. And the goal is to take all that feedback and deliver the best building for the town of Hopkinton. So just to summarize, we started with 44 sites, and we whittled that down to consider the available space the town already owned adjacent to the Marathon School, as well as rebuilding on the Elmwood property. And because the MSBA requires it, we also looked at whether or not it was feasible to do an ad reno of the existing Elmwood School, or whether if we just did nothing and brought the existing Elmwood School up to today's standards, what would that cost? All of those costs were evaluated in ESBC meetings where we discussed them in the end of January and 2 meetings in early February. And all of those ESBC meetings, which have been 21 to date, are available The minutes of those meetings are available, and most of them are available actually as YouTube videos on HCAM's YouTube feed. So you can see the matrix that was developed for considering which of those sites we should use, as well as a lot of the deliberation that occurred to get to the point that we are at in the process. We'll continue that process moving forward, as there's going to be 6 more ESBC meetings between now and when the committee finalizes the schematic design. So if you would like to be involved in the process or make yourself heard beyond these forums, those are public meetings and the public is always welcome to attend. So as part of the process, a question that comes up is, cost. And we've certainly heard from the community that there's a lot of interest in what this project will cost, that we find the right cost that the community wants to support. And the MSBA actually publishes a lot of information about what their projects cost. They have data on the various projects that they've worked on going all the way back to the beginning, and that's available on their website, but it can often be difficult to understand because there's so many variables that come into play when you're comparing one town's project to another town's project. It's important to remember that every project is different. When you look at a project, it's based on the local town's educational plan. So that's going to define things like class size, how special education works, how special curriculum activities work, how many times you need to have lunch or recess or phys ed. And that's going to define the quantities that are in your project. There's also local requirements that come up. There's in the town of Hopkinton alone, the town recently passed a net zero resolution that requires public boards such as the ESBC to make decisions about projects that are in support of the town's net zero goals. There's also other changes like stretch codes that get adopted by certain towns, and all of those local requirements can have a factor in how one town arrives at a certain budget. There's also, when you look at a construction project estimate and you're looking at the cost between two projects, it's important to keep in mind that an estimated project is looking at how much that project will cost at the date it is bid. For Elmwood, we're looking at a project that will be bid in August of 2025. So we'll apply an escalation to those projects so that that's based on what costs would be estimated today, so that the price that we're telling you for the project is what we believe the town can build that project for when we go out to bid. When you're looking at historic data, they'll be they may not is a percentage change year after year. But in actuality, in construction, those are historical records that look at the totality of a project. If a project had more sheet metal and was bid when sheet metal was spiking, then it may not be a straight one-to-one comparison to escalate those amounts. So it's important to understand that we're really looking towards the future and using the best guess that we have about what inflation will become. The other important thing to remember with inflation in the news so much lately is that inflation is not something that happens and it year after year. So if you have a year of 2% inflation and then a year of 8% inflation, then a year of 12% inflation, each year you're building on the previous year's inflation. And so while the total inflation can't just be added with the percentages, over the last 4 years, we're looking at about 30.8% inflation overall. And that's really, over the last 2 years, been the largest sustained construction inflation over the last 40 years through multiple elements of the building construction. So that's really something that needs to be factored in and can be difficult to take into account when you're looking at historic data versus today's cost. The other thing to keep in mind is that while all MSBA projects do use the same space template, they'll customize it based on their educational plan. You'll have a different sized gym or a different sized cafeteria based on the number of times that you want to have lunch or gym during the course of the day. You'll have a different number of classrooms based on the district's chosen student classroom size based on the educational plan. And so all of those decisions factor into the space program that's developed for that specific school. So it can be difficult to compare them one to another. Next slide, if you could. So the MSBA, in addition to all the real detailed information they give you about cost, they issue this overall summary. And this is available for both new construction and ad reno projects. And you can go to the MSBA's website, massschoolbuildings.org, and you can take a look at how this fits into the overall picture. We've highlighted a couple of things here. One, we've highlighted where the Marathon project fits in this overall timeline, as well as where the Elmwood fits into this overall timeline. The plus signs are estimated projects, whereas the squares are bid projects. So those are projects that have either received construction bids or in some cases have already had their what's called the PFA, or the project funding agreement, decided with the MSBA. If you go to the next slide, what we've illustrated here is how inflation can really be seen in these this data. Over the course leading up to the start of the pandemic, there was really a fairly stable inflation. And so that line, while not straight, was a gradual curve because there wasn't really anything influencing it when you look at that trend line. Over the last 3 or 4 years, inflation has been about 1.5%, then 8%, then it spiked again to 10%. And you can really see in the spread of the various projects how different decisions and that increased inflation have really increased the range of prices that towns are getting back in terms of those different projects. And you can see how a year with 8.5% inflation followed by 10.5% inflation really moves the needle upward, both in terms of where the critical mass of those prices are and also where the bottom of those prices are. There's a much bigger jump from when you were looking at projects that were bid in, say, 2021 versus projects that are being bid now. The floor of where those bids are coming in was much higher. We also thought that it was helpful in this to see where Elmwood fits in terms of the current projects that are out there in the MSBA program. And as you can see, there's 4 projects that are clustered together. So we thought we would take a deeper look at those specific projects just to sort of illustrate some of the points that we talked about. Because as you can see, that trend line is tipping up. And all of those 4 projects are currently clustered fairly close together. What those 4 projects make up is Elmwood's Elementary School, Whitman Hansen's Middle School, which issued a PSR on about the same time frame, as well as a high school and a vocational high school. And the vocational high school and the high school, which is in East Longmeadow High School, don't fit as well as a comparison to an elementary school, largely because some of the programmatic elements cost a little bit more. They have a little more infrastructure and other things. But we thought we'd take a deep dive at how we compare to Whitman Hansen, because we think it explains how these comparisons can be challenging. So when you first look, Whitman Hansen's per square foot construction number is a lot lower than, or is somewhat lower than Elmwood's. It's maybe 3-4% lower. But when you look at the details of Whitman Hansen's school, it's only for 675 students, and it's 137,000 square foot building versus 176 for Elmwood. So even though we have a significantly lower population within the school, they have a lot more square footage. And so it can be difficult to say, why are they able to provide it for so much lower? But when you look at it from a different metric in terms of how much is each town paying for a building to educate a student a year, the cost per student per year is significantly lower when you look at Elmwood versus Whitman, because there's certain cost efficiencies that come with a larger school and more shared program. And so you really see that we're almost 30% lower in terms of a per student value for the current estimate on Elmwood. And because these are estimated at the same time, there's less inflation that needs to be factored in. And so we looked a little deeper at Whitman Hansen, if you go to the next slide, to understand how are those differences coming across. And so if you look on the screen to the left, you see their existing site. and on the right is their proposed. And a couple of takeaways we took from this was that they have an established site, and that's a big deal because we're building in a forest with where we're putting Elmwood, and so there's a little more site development cost associated with that. We'll have to make room for the site. We'll have to grade the site, and all of those things were already done for them to a certain degree with the Whitman Hanson School. Another thing, if you've watched in the past, is that we talked a lot about swing space, and swing space was one of the big costs that made it so that the Elmwood site was not as cost effective as the Hayden Rowe site, because that swing space requires that you relocate the students during construction. In this case, Whitman Hanson's existing school can be used, so they don't need to provide swing space on their existing site. Whereas on our Elmwood site, we would have needed to provide for that swing space, which was many millions of dollars. So all of those factor into how these two schools, despite the fact that they're on the same timeline, that they're relatively similar in grade level, can have diverging costs. And when we look at that in terms of other buildings, those same different factors will always come up. There may be code changes between older buildings and newer. There may be, for instance, we're pursuing geothermal at Elmwood, but at Marathon, there was more of a conventional system used. And so all of those can factor into how a project from the past compares to a project in the future, or even two projects on the same timeline, because of the differences that are unique to those projects. So
the slide that's in front of you now is just a recap of the outreach we've done to the faculty in the forums over the timeline of the project. There's been a large outreach. We've had many dedicated faculty forums throughout the fall, and they continue even this week. You see at the bottom on the right-hand side of the screen, there's been studies and user group meetings with both the Elmwood and the Hopkins population. So there's been a lot of feedback that's come back through all the various educators and levels of educators associated with both schools.
Do you want me to, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. If you want to add anything, Anne, feel free to.
No, I just wanted to say that both the faculties at both schools, I was muted. I was going through the list, but no one could hear me. There have been lots of opportunities for the teachers to give input. And one of the most exciting of those, while there's lots of dates on the screen in front of people, the most exciting work has been happening recently. And on April 4th, 5th, and 6th, and now June 6th, 7th, and 8th, teachers have been meeting with the architects at Elmwood School and at Hopkins. And what I can see teachers doing is looking at the layout of the buildings. And today, for example, I watched a group of third grade teachers who looked at the pictures. They were invited to talk about any part of the project that they wanted to share, and they really wanted to have in their hands the pictures of what their classroom might look like. There's all kinds of exciting feedback. There are people who are, the Vertex folks are taking notes of, is there any way that this door could be over here? Or, tiny tweaks that are making teachers feel really excited about the project. And some bigger tweaks where teachers are really appreciative to have their voices heard. And the schedule that you share really outlines lots of opportunities for teachers to brainstorm, to listen, and to share good ideas. So I want to make sure that families at home and folks who are watching know that this is all being done with lots of really important feedback from all of the staff, paraprofessionals, related arts teachers, wellness teams, and therapists. And they're sharing important things. So thank you.
And so we thought it made sense to have to hear from the district about how some of those educational needs are being met. So I'll turn this over to Dr. Kavanaugh.
Thank you. I'm unmuting. So thank you, Chris. So as we have been talking about the educational needs, we will need 54 classrooms in the new school. And I know that that feels like quite a lot, but what we're talking about is about 18 classrooms per grade level. We also will have 6 ESOL half classrooms, and our ESOL teachers really reported that they like being together for collaboration and support. And as Mrs. Carver was just talking about, when we reach out to the teachers and we say, what would you like? Originally we had those rooms separated, and the teacher said, no, please, can we be together? And that's really nice for them, not only to collaborate, but then it allows them to switch students, share materials, be collaborative in lesson planning, and all of those things. We love the idea of having breakout spaces, and many of the people from this panel tonight were able to go and visit schools where they have breakout spaces. So in sort of a small school community, and what we have been talking about is when a child goes to this new school, they will start in a wing as a second grader, stay in that wing as a third grader, stay in that wing as a fourth grader. So you are part of a neighborhood community, but you also have these breakout spaces where kids from multiple classrooms can come out. And whether they are doing some project-based learning or getting some kind of reading support or math support, they live in that community space. We have 3 STEs, which is science, technology, and engineering rooms, and those can be converted to health rooms as needed. When we take a look at our media center, we're very excited about that because it will be 2 stories. And, if we are keeping collections of second grade materials, for example, on the second floor, then on the first floor, then the second floor can be devoted to third and fourth grade materials. One of the things that we start to see in third and fourth grade is that, some of those standards, especially in the content areas, social studies and science, begin to ramp up. So it feels like that's an appropriate place to store those materials. And the nice thing I think about the second floor media center is that you'll see that the STE rooms are kind of flanking that space. And there's also a maker space there. When we take a look at some of the needs, that in our current schools, we have only 1 art room, or 1 music room, or 1 gymnasium. We're going to need to increase those spaces. So we'll have 2 art, 2 music, and then multiple stations for gym. The cafeteria will be sized for 3 lunches, and you'll see that there are probably going to be about 400 students in a lunch. And we've done some work to make sure that that cafeteria feels really homey and feels like there are separate areas. So even if you are in a very large space, it won't feel that way to the students who are eating lunch there. And we need to meet the nurses' standards, the kitchen and custodial standards, just in terms of square footage. So there will be, in fact, a counselor space for each one of the wings and an assistant principal space for each one of those wings. There will be outdoor learning spaces for our kids. And, outdoor learning isn't just a sort of gratuitous thing. The lessons that would be designed there would be designed to meet science standards, social studies standards, ELA standards, and the outdoor space should be sort of seamlessly connected to the indoor space. And at the entry, there will be a canopy. And as you know, we have lots of kids in this building, so we'll have lots of buses. And as kids are moving out to those buses, we want to make sure that they're protected from the elements as they're doing that. So you can see the things that have been accepted by the MSBA as reimbursable, and then some of the things that have not been accepted by the MSBA as reimbursable. And so while a book room, for example, might not be reimbursable, that's something that we cannot do without. One final thing, a notion that I want to dispel is that, there's something really Taj Mahalish about this. And that's not necessarily true. When you look at the things that are required, the classrooms, the ESOL classrooms, the health rooms, the art rooms, the music rooms, there's, sort of nothing superfluous there. Those are really kind of your basic things that we would need in any elementary school. But they do meet our educational plan. They do meet our student enrollment.
Yeah, and I will only add that really piggybacking on what Dr. Kavanaugh is saying, that these requirements really, they come from the state and they are honed and made specific for Hopkinton. They are purely based on need, and the MSBA recognizes that need, and that's why most of this has been accepted. Even the very, very small spaces that were not reimbursed by the MSBA, they understand the need And they're just trying to make sure that their funding is equitable and goes pretty far across other districts. So I will walk us
And
through.
Bob, before you jump into that, I just wanted to let the audience know we do see your questions coming in, and if you came late to the presentation, we will answer them all at the end, but we're going to work through all of the slides, and we will address all the questions at the end.
Yeah, and I'll move, the stuff that I have to show isn't entirely new. I'll move relatively quickly, and then we can come back for question and answer. What we're looking at here is a zoomed in site plan. To the north, or to the upper portion of the screen, is the Marathon School. The roadway that you're seeing is a kind of an internal campus roadway that connects the Marathon School to the new Elmwood School. So this site is right along Hayden Row. It's further south from the Marathon School. The school is designed specifically so that the building is pushed a little bit toward the back of the site, not too far back. It's intentional to make sure that the traffic and the cars can really be pulled off of Hayden Row and can be managed on the site. What we're seeing here are the roadway that cars and buses would follow toward the Elmwood School. The blue dotted line represents where cars would split away and they would wrap around the building to create a car queue of 85, where the blue dotted lines are shown. Buses, meanwhile, would sweep around the front, and we have half of the 9 buses in total that would be arriving here or be queued up here. They would actually swap with the other 9 buses at the Marathon School. So the total of 18 would be back and forth between the 2 schools. We have done a lot of work to tighten up the amount of paving. In fact, we're down to what we project as the real needs for staff and some visitors. We have overflow parking for events that is not paved, but will be of a suitable material. The paving and the roadway around the building is contained pretty tight and economical. We've tried to look at reducing the amount of pavement, and that also reduces the amount of environmental impact as well, which we're well aware of. During the day, this loop road would be gated and closed so that the students have access unfettered and without vehicular traffic around the back of the building. They can actually use the hard surface play as part of the play space. And then the gates would open up upon arrival or departure. There's also a separation here of PE fields for the gym classes and recess zones in the back of the school. Students would go right from the classroom to the recess. They would go right from the gym to the PE field. So it's zoned pretty well. A lot of attention has been paid to maintainability, durability, and cost effectiveness. We'll also get into the traffic aspects of that in a little bit. What we're looking at here are the overall schematic floor plans, the first floor, second, and third floor. It should be familiar to anybody that's been following. It's a 3-floor, 3-wing plan, and that's very deliberate to help break down the scale of the building and make a very efficient layout for the school. As Carol and Ann have described, we've been working not only with the leadership, but with the educators to make sure that we're meeting the needs and the educational vision for the school. And so here we break down the plan and show how it meets all those needs. And just starting with a warm and welcoming and safe school, we've done that by making the approach to the school highly visible from the administration, not only the entrance and the control of the vestibule, but actually looking at the drop-off zone and the parking. So that's important. It's set up just right for a safe school and for welcoming and greeting students into the school. Upon arrival, there's views to the outdoor learning, outdoor landscape space, and that helps bring daylight in. And that's going to help make it warm and welcoming as well as connect the school quite literally to the indoor and outdoor program and the connections that are desirable. If I go up from the first floor, actually, I'll pause here just to say that the spaces you see in yellow here at the front of the building are all the community spaces, the large spaces like the gymnasium, the lower level of the media center, and it extends up to the second floor, as well as the cafeteria. The classroom wings that I'll describe in just a moment are these 3 wings here. We're calling them neighborhoods. And as we go up 1 floor onto the second floor, what we can see here is that's deliberate to create really a 6-room 8 rooms total, but 6 classrooms plus a few adjacent special needs or support rooms to create a small learning environment, small neighborhood. It's envisioned that the 2nd grade would be on the 1st floor, the 3rd grade would be on the 2nd floor, and the 4th grade would be on the 3rd floor, so that a student might have their experience in the ground floor here at 2nd grade and then move up vertically through the floor levels, still maintaining a very small school experience within this larger school. We can see in the center here, this is the media center, the main portion of the media center. And it was intentional to create the media center as the hub of the school. And it's flanked by science, technology, and engineering rooms. Finally, up at the 3rd floor, you can see that continues, that kind of heart and hub to the school includes the art rooms and additional STE rooms, some that will be used for help, as Dr. Kavanaugh had explained. All in all, we can see a number of ways that this is really intentionally meeting the educational needs and through the positioning of space, creating a lot of opportunities as well. We know scale is important. These are 3 grades coming together, and we have increased enrollment. So we've worked hard to make sure that the overall mass of the building is friendly and approachable. So you can see we really have a 1-story portion in the front with some 2-story. So that really mitigates the 3-story portion of the building and is part of your entry sequence. We also look at the design of the exterior and where we see here a solid 3-story durable masonry building. Some of the things that we do are incorporate color and kind of a lighter feel, so that 3rd floor, that upper level kind of fades away. We go ahead and add clear story glass that helps bring daylight into some of those large spaces, but it also starts to drop the height or the perception of the height of the building. We add a base to the building, and that's for durability, but it also, again, introduces a new material down low and helps break up the scale and the size of the building. We add further fenestration, the windows on the school, as well as the canopy that Carol and Ann had spoken about, that really is part of your arrival and gives you that more intimate approach and feeling to the school. And then finally, we highlight some of the spaces and intend to have a little bit of fun where we see the media center or the cafeteria that brings a little life and joy into the building, but all pretty simple and logical. The buildings that the building materials that we're talking about for the school are predominantly masonry. It's virtually a full masonry building. A few different forms of brick would be used for the body of the building, and then more of a light colored block for the 3rd floor, which also extends around the back. This lighter material is also great, even though it's, again, masonry and durable, to help reflect light and really kind of bring vibrant ambient light into the courtyards and the outdoor spaces. So I'm happy to come back to any of those, but I'm going to turn it over to the sustainability team for some descriptions of scope.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So there's a lot to talk about in sustainability. I'm just going to cover a few things that we're working on at the moment. But just to put all of this in context as well, I think, Chris mentioned this earlier, but with the recent passing of the Net Zero Energy Resolution, in the town of Hopkinton, I think, this shines a new light on our focus and approach. We were already going in this direction, but the commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045 and the interim targets by 50% of 2030, this allows us to look at the school in a different way. This should become a catalyst for change in the town of Hopkinton and kind of an opportunity for us to dip our toes in this, net zero carbon emissions target and how we're going to start to make progress through this. So if you go to the next slide, just further context here. When we talk about reaching net zero carbon emissions, there's a lot involved with that. Buildings are a part of it, but so is kind of transportation, electricity, and a variety of other variables. So all of this is certainly a part of getting us to that ultimate goal. But schools in particular have the opportunity, as I said, to become a catalyst towards that. There's also stretch code implications, which were discussed earlier. I won't go into these in great detail, but there's a lot of kind of overlapping regulations that are starting to come into play that guide us further down this goal of needing to meet at net zero with this school. So on that note, there's a lot of ways to get to net zero. Systems are part of it, and design are an equal part of that as well. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the decisions that have been made around systems so far, and how we got to those decisions. So as you see on the screen here, there's 4 different HVAC system options that were studied in great detail, looking at first cost as well as holistic life cycle cost assessments that were done for 3 systems that were all electric and 1 system that was a more typical natural gas boiler heater, as you see listed here. If you go to the next slide, when I mentioned kind of looking at this holistic life cycle cost assessment, this was the analysis that was conducted. The all-electric option, the all-electric options that you see here are the 1, 2, and 4, with number 3 being the natural gas option. We looked at both first costs, as I mentioned, as well as life cycle costs over a 30-year period. And ultimately, the choice that we're moving forward with is the electric geothermal ground source heat pump system. So number 1, as you'll see listed here. Now, there's a few other things that are overlapping with this that come into play. So there's an opportunity through mass save incentives, as well as through the Inflation Reduction Act incentives for not only the system to be the cheapest over the 30-year lifespan, as you see, but also for the first costs after the project is opened and completed to also significantly be lower if we're pursuing incentives such as mass save and IRA. So these are all decisions that were evaluated and went into play into the selection of an all-electric geothermal ground source heat pump system for this project. Now, net zero energy is great. It's where things are headed. It's where we need to go, as we just discussed. But ultimately, we know that the goal here is really to create a positive educational environment. And now I'm going to highlight a little bit about what we mean by that. So there's an overlap between net zero energy and net positive education, and that really comes down to kind of the data and analysis that our team is doing as we're making smart design decisions. So the plans that Bob was just sharing, we have paid careful attention in detail to kind of the site and massing analysis of this. So we're already elongating our classroom wings along an east-west axis. We did a lot of analysis, looked very closely at kind of the angles and the orientation of these to 1, reduce energy, 2, improve daylight within those classroom wings, and 3, improve thermal comfort within those outside courtyard spaces in between. So we actually worked through a series of iterations and optimizations that you see on the right here to make that impact. So save us energy, but also improve daylight and thermal comfort. Next, after we kind of worked through that massing assessment, we've been working on a window to wall ratio analysis, which has been informing some of the elevation design that Bob was showing. So going around the whole building and looking at actual solar radiation as it falls on that massing allows us to then set what we call window to wall ratio targets. And what this means is we're essentially determining how much glass we should put on each facade based on the amount of solar radiation that's going to hit that surface. What this allows us to do is, again, save energy, but also improve daylight conditions in the interior. So net zero energy plus net positive education. So this is just an example of one of the building wings where we kind of went through and did this assessment. And now as we've been going through and designing the exterior, we've been using these window to wall ratio targets to inform that. And then finally, we've also been running preliminary daylight studies. So while we're doing all of this, we're looking at how we can influence and increase daylight into those interior spaces. All floors are not created equal in this scenario. We're really looking at, how can we get more daylight into the bottom floors, and looking at how we can design the windows in each of, in each of these buildings as we wrap the building to come up with an increase in what we call daylight autonomy. So less need to use electric lighting throughout the course of the year, while also reducing glare to make sure that we're not having to pull shades all the time. So we want to maintain that benefit, that connectivity with the outdoors. So that's why we're starting this early. And not all windows are created equal. So looking at how the design of the facade allows us to increase that daylight distribution and minimize glare is what we're doing right now.
Great. Thanks, Heather.
Okay, before we get into traffic, just wanted to take a brief detour, and we've had a number of questions that we will address that talk about cost and what the committee is doing around managing the cost of this building. So I wanted to do a quick set of highlights around some of the decisions that have been made and some of the decisions that have yet to be made around cost for this building. The first one, as most people are familiar with, is that the school committee decided that this building should house the 4th grade as well as the 2nd and 3rd grade. And this was after a lot of research by the school committee, the district, and the ESBC on the options. And this has a significant cost impact, given that we know that some of the crowding problems within the schools are not limited to Elmwood. And this allows us to actually not only build space for that 4th grade outside of the existing buildings, but get MSBA reimbursement for that. Whereas an expansion at another building would not be eligible for MSBA reimbursement and would likely be as costly. The site choice had a cost driver as well. When looking at between the two sites, the Hayden Road site consolidates a lot of the busing, reducing the transportation costs that'll be necessary for operating the building. But also in construction, as Chris mentioned earlier, to build on the Elmwood site would have required getting temporary space to educate the students during the construction, which would have had a really large cost to rent that space in addition to the operational challenges it would create. Dr. Kavanaugh mentioned that we have really focused on the eligible reimbursement spaces so that we make sure that we're not putting anything in there that is not deemed as necessary by the MSBA when it comes to the educational model, and therefore will be eligible for reimbursement. Because obviously ineligible spaces are the most expensive, and we've done our best to really reduce the amount of those spaces. Our designers at Perkins Eastman are constantly working on the efficiency of the design of the building. And if you watch some of our meetings, you'll see that they show us new versions each time with slight changes in the angles of the wings that actually have the impact of reducing the gross square footage of the building, and therefore the overall cost to build the building. Thus far, they've reduced that gross building area by 1,000 square feet over the first design that they showed us. And this was really specifically not only them looking for educational efficiencies, but they're trying to be very responsive to what the committee and the community are saying about the cost of this building being a concern. So if we go to the next one, Bob mentioned we've done our best to reduce asphalt and impervious surfaces around the building, which is both great from an environmental perspective, but also reduces the cost of the building. So that while there may be some places where we could have added a loop road around the PE fields and it might have had some benefits to internal traffic or maintenance, we didn't think it was worth it for the cost that it would be to have that additional asphalt. Our designers have done a great job of thinking about how to use the site, including some outdoor classrooms. And I think when people think about outdoor classrooms, as Dr. Kavanaugh mentioned, you get this sort of vision, but really what it is just creating an outdoor space for students to be able to go outside and learn when the conditions allow. As they do in schools in Hopkinton today, they just don't have the design space for it. We like this concept, but we wanted to keep it as efficient as possible. So we reduced the original design to 1 classroom per grade level. The next one is the HVAC and mechanical systems. The committee right now is projecting going forward with the geothermal heating system. The trick to this one is that it is both the least costly on an operational level going forward over the life of the system. It also is potentially significantly less costly from an upfront perspective, due, as Heather said, to the rebates that are available to the town as a result of choosing this system. The tricky part about this is it looks more expensive because when we go to town meeting for the appropriation, we have
but we're not able to realize those rebates until after the fact. Can we go to the next slide? And then upcoming project decisions, you'll hear more about traffic shortly. We're also going to look at the way that we're going to manage this project, construction manager versus a design bid build procurement, as well as the material selections and finalizing the project scope that we're all going to try to do by the end of June, so that in July at some point we can really have a full accounting for the town of what the design will be that's going to go to town meeting. And so we'll get into some of the specific questions when we get to the Q&A around those, but I just wanted to highlight some of those decisions that have been made and will be made. The next thing we're going to talk about is traffic. So I'm going to hand it over to our traffic engineer, Vinod.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks like my video isn't turning on. So maybe I may need to be added as a presenter. But I can continue presenting though. So again, my name is Vinod Kalikiri. I'm a transportation planner on the project team. And what we have over the next few slides is a brief summary of the extensive transportation traffic work that we've been doing for over, I would say, 9-10 months, parallel to everything else that you're hearing about the space planning within the building and the grade consolidation, the costs and everything else that you're talking about. We're also looking at a lot of the traffic operations and how to manage traffic flow and improve conditions wherever possible. So what you see here is about a 1.2 mile stretch of Hayden Row Street with a series of key intersections shown by those dots. Essentially, that corridor, what you see there with all of the cross streets and the driveways being the study area for what we're looking at as part of our transportation analysis. Again, all with the goal of making sure that the traffic flow associated with this project, first and foremost, does not make things worse, right? I mean, so there is congestion today. We're trying, different things to improve those conditions wherever possible, but at a minimum, as a threshold for our analysis, we want to make sure that the project that we're talking about here does not make things worse, and that we're able to achieve with the plan that I'll be describing. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that we have heard right from the beginning on this project has been essentially the safety, pedestrian safety, in general safety of vehicular traffic along Hayden Row Street, partly related to speeding of vehicles during certain times of the day. Obviously, just at the school start time and end times, there is congestion, turning traffic that slows down vehicles, and you have rolling queues. But there is definitely a concern about speeds, and so that was one of the things that we really paid a close attention to as we went through the analysis. And you'll see on this graphic the different types of speed limits and speed regulations that cover that 1.2 mile stretch of road, which obviously could get very confusing to drivers. Next slide, please. Again, on this slide, we took a couple of slides that show some data that we collected for this project. Some of it we've already presented at prior meetings, but essentially the data, this slide shows speed of vehicles over a continuous 24-hour period. Actually, it's a 48-hour period that we collected the data. The posted speed limit is, it varies, as you saw on the previous slide, but consistently we've noticed that vehicles on an average or better than average 85th percentile speed of being in the order of 40 miles per hour, which obviously during school times, if there isn't a lot of queues on the road, 40 miles per hour can be perceived as being very high for that corridor, given the narrow lanes and the geometry. Next slide, please. This slide, it's just a data slide that shows the hourly traffic flow on Hayden Row Street, northbound traffic in blue, each hour of the day, the hours being on the x-axis, and then the y-axis representing the number of vehicles per hour that are traveling in each direction. So northbound is in blue, the southbound is in orange, and the vertical lines that you see there in the morning and afternoon represent the times when the schools start in the morning, the high school and the middle school represented by the magenta line, and then the middle elementary schools represented by the orange line, and correspondingly the dismissal time in the afternoon for the high school, middle school occurring earlier than the elementary schools. The key takeaway in this is that the peak of the traffic on the roads occurs outside of the school peak times. Yes, there is congestion during school hours, just start and end times, and a lot of that is driven by turning traffic and with the crossing guards stopping traffic to let pedestrians cross. But in terms of the sheer volume of traffic, the peak times actually falls outside of the school's start and end times, and everything that we are looking at would not change that. The peaks would continue to fall outside of the school peak times, which is actually a critical thing. We don't want the peak times of the schools to coincide with the peak time of the traffic on the roadway, which obviously compounds the issues. Next slide, please. So in terms of, after looking at the current conditions, we took a deep dive at what we would expect for the future conditions. So we looked at the MSBA projections for the next 10 years. We have a lot of data, projections in terms of enrollment growth for not just Elmwood School or how many students are going to go to this new school, but also general growth, the expected growth in enrollment at each of the schools along Hayden Row Street. So we took that into account. We took into consideration the fact that the fourth graders would essentially move from the west side of Hayden Row Street from Hopkins to the new school. The sixth graders would move from the middle school to Hopkins School, but also Hopkins School would have a change in start and end times, whereas today Hopkins starts and ends coincidental with the elementary school times. And the plan going forward is to have Hopkins match its start and end times with the middle and high school. So we had to factor all of that into our transportation analysis so that we are not only looking at what's happening on the ground today, but what will happen in the future with 10 years of growth and some of these changes. We also took into consideration some of the other planned projects, developments in town that we have identified with input from planning and engineering staff. There are other projects, trails, and multimodal projects that are being discussed in town independent of this project. We are aware of those, but we haven't specifically factored in any mode of travel changes associated with those projects because a lot of the details are not available for some of those plans, especially the trails projects. Next slide, please. So that again, there's a lot of numbers in there, but that's essentially a projection over the next 10 years of enrollment growth for all of the schools on Hayden Row Street that we took into account for our analysis. Next slide. And some of the key findings, we did find the underlying speed limit being 40 miles per hour. A lot of the drivers do adhere to that underlying speed limits, but the compliance during school hours, which is essentially 20 miles per hour, that is not as consistent. We do see people speeding or driving at higher speeds during those times when they're able to. There was some safety issues, crash history at the Chestnut Street, Hayden Row Street intersection, but that intersection obviously, as you know, has been upgraded and signalized in 2018, and the crash incidence has significantly improved or reduced at that location. There is significant queuing in the left turn lane, turning left into Marathon School in the morning and in the afternoon when parents and buses are turning into the school driveway. We did take that into consideration. And then obviously, as I mentioned, crossing guards who act as traffic control to allow pedestrians and buses to turn into and out of the driveways. That does add to some of the congestion that you experience. Next slide. So some of the elements of the plan that you saw earlier, the site plan, one of the key features of that is that internal connection that Bob presented, the connection between Marathon School and Hayden and the new Elmwood School. That internal connection does help alleviate some of the congestion on Hayden Row Street, so you don't have as much queuing or need to stack vehicles on Hayden Row Street, when you have the ability to use the cross connection. We are mindful of the fact that, both schools need to function efficiently, so we are working on the site plan to make sure that vehicular queuing and pickup drop-off operations for both schools work efficiently. We did identify the need for certain improvements along Hayden Row Street, both under current conditions, but also definitely in the future with the added school. Shifting of grades between the schools and changing of the times does actually have a beneficial effect on traffic. Although not a significant benefit, there is a noticeable change in traffic operations during certain times of the day, just because of the changes in the grades at Hopkins and at the middle school. And then we are also looking at ways to improve the speed regulations along the corridor so that you don't have a lot of varying speed limits or posted speed limits along the corridor. And that's a process that we would need to go through even post-construction. One of the key findings, though, is that with the improvements that I'm going to be presenting next, there is minimal impact of this project on other intersections along the corridor. And I know that was one of the key concerns or considerations when we did the large transportation study. Wanted to make sure that we are not only just looking at what the new school needs for traffic improvements, but also make sure that this project does not have unintended consequences of impacting other intersections or roadways along the corridor, and that is not the case. Next slide, please. So in a snapshot, this plan actually shows the overall corridor enhancement or improvements along Hayden Row Street. Essentially at the two driveways. On this plan, Hayden Row Street is the roadway that you see from left to right. Main Street is to the left and left of the sheet, and Chestnut Street is to the right, so that south is to the right side of the graphic. So the plan that you'll see, I don't know if we could zoom in a little bit, Bob, onto the intersection, the Marathon driveway. Maybe not. I can point it out right on this. So the plan would be to signalize the intersection of the Marathon driveway with Hayden Row Street. So that would provide, today you have two signalized intersections on either side, but obviously the Marathon driveway is not signalized. That does cause certain issues with queuing, ability of the residents close to this driveway from being able to turn left or right during school hours. When there is congestion along the road, we've heard concerns about being able to turn or not being able to turn at certain times, and some of those concerns would be improved by creating, by installing a new traffic signal that actually creates gaps in traffic for some of the side street movements, including the Marathon driveway as well as the new driveway that you see to the right side of the graphic. Some of the other features that you see on this plan, the left turn lane that I mentioned earlier, today it's only about 175 feet long, which is not adequate even just to support the Marathon school traffic. Queues often spill back past the turn lane and spill out into the through lane of Hayden Row Street, impeding traffic flow and partly causing some of the rolling queues that you see there during school times. This plan calls for more than doubling the length of the turn lane. So we're showing on this plan approximately 400 feet of a storage length, stacking length on that road. So 175 feet would be increased to 400 feet. All of the widening would be to the east or to the top of this page. We are holding the sidewalk and the curb line on the west side of the road, so that the west edge of Hayden Row Street would not be touched. All of the widening would be to the east side of the road, and that's reflected in this graphic in blue. So in addition to the signal that controls the turning traffic, it provides a protected phase in the signal. So when you have left turning vehicles that wants to enter Marathon, they get an actual green arrow. So the through traffic is stopped for several seconds when that left turning traffic is cleared efficiently without causing spillbacks or backups into the through lanes. The pedestrian crossing at that intersection, the existing pedestrian crossing that's controlled by a crossing guard today, will have a push button actuated pedestrian signal. So that'll be fully actuated. The crossing guard would still be needed, likely during school hours, but maybe not. They may not need to control traffic as much as they do today, just because this would be a fully functional state-of-the-art traffic signal with a protected pedestrian crosswalk. Going to the right side on this graphic towards the new driveway for Elmwood School, you'll see that we're recommending widening of Hayden Row Street through that section. So essentially between the two driveways, to be able to create another left turn lane, essentially a left turn pocket that would allow vehicles that need to go to the new school to stack in that left turn lane when needed. So vehicles that are coming south from Main Street, for example, can either turn at the signal at Marathon Driveway if they want to use this protected signal, or they could use the through lane to get to that left turn lane and go directly to the new school. And then, as I mentioned, there's an internal connection between the two driveways. So essentially, we're creating a loop, two-way roadway loop around these driveways that would help manage traffic very efficiently and keeping a lot of that queuing and stacking outside of the through traffic flow on Hayden Row. The lane coming out of the new driveway, just because this intersection would be unsignalized, would be restricted to right turns only. So if you're coming out of this driveway, the only movement that's allowed would be right turn heading towards the other schools or towards Main Street. And if you want to make a left turn to go towards Chestnut Street, the option would be to use the internal connection between the driveways and use the signalized left turn, which again helps manage traffic flow, and you don't have left turners trying to sneak out into the traffic flow, causing congestion and backups and safety concerns. There is a crosswalk that we are proposing at that driveway. That crosswalk will be furnished with push button actuated flashing beacon, rectangular rapid flashing beacon. That would be a high visibility treatment because that intersection itself is unsignalized. Even though there wouldn't be a full signal, pedestrians, when they push the button, would activate the flashing LED lights, which would be visible to drivers oncoming traffic. And that crosswalk connects to a system of internal sidewalks and walkways within the school system. We did make sure that there is a strong pedestrian connection within the school property, as well as pedestrian connections to Marathon School, as well as to the EMC Park as needed. A lot of the design is still being fleshed out, but the goal is to make sure that whether it's a pedestrian coming to the school or someone's dropping them off in their personal vehicles or coming to school by bus, all modes of travel are efficiently handled. And we looked at various ways to organize the traffic flow, turn restrictions with signals, without signals, and the plan that you see here we found is essentially an optimal combination of the features that we could incorporate into a design to improve the overall traffic flow and efficiency through this area. And again, this will obviously continue to get refined as we go through the process, but we are very comfortable at this point that this plan can efficiently handle the future traffic flow through this area with all of the growth and projections in enrollment. So this is a plan not just for the current conditions, it takes into account the growth in the future. And yeah, I think that covers the overall plan. And there are a lot of details in the plan that we could get into as part of Q&A.
Thanks, Vinod.
Thank you.
I do just want to quickly contextualize, because the one thing about these forums is we're doing them at a point in time in a process. And so while you may have seen in the sustainability presentation, the committee has heard a lot from the engineers and done a lot of questions and analysis of those systems. The traffic data that Vinod has put together in phenomenal depth is relatively new to us. So we just got this report that you're seeing late last week. We had an opportunity to meet on Monday, but obviously we need to involve the town, we need to involve public safety before we can determine what of these proposed mitigations make sense for this solution. So I just wanted to put that out there for contextual purposes, that this proposed plan is one that we still have a lot of work to do on. So certainly we don't need to look at anything as decided. So I think with that, I want to thank all of the presenters, and we'll move on to the Q&A section. So we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. Which we appreciate everyone putting those in. If you would like to ask a question live, you can raise your hand and we can activate your microphone. But at the moment, I don't see any hands raised, so maybe we can start going through the ones that are in the Q&A. Oh. Actually, we just had somebody raise their hand. So Ellen Holmes, I'm going to allow you to talk. So if you can take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Yes, I'd like to know how many feet of our property at 139 Hayden Rose Street is going to go where we're on the east side and you're going to put a lane in. How many feet is that going to be?
That's a great question. So one thing I overlooked mentioning on that graphic that you saw, there are a couple of red, there are red lines that you see on that plan. Those are the property lines. All of the widening and all of the improvements that are shown on this plan are fully contained within the public right-of-way. So the roadway fits fully, even the widened roadway fits fully within the town's roadway layout. But to answer your question, in terms of the amount of widening, that turn lane on an average is about 10 feet wide. So, I mean, again, we need to do a final design on it, and it could be 11 feet or 10 and a half feet, but generally in the order of magnitude of about 10 feet. But what I do want to highlight again on this graphic, you'll see between the blue line and the red line, blue line representing the new edge of road and the red line representing the right of way, there's still a good 12 feet away, the red line. So there's another 12 feet of right of way available even after completing this widening. So should there be other projects, sidewalks or other things that are planned on the east side of the road in the future unrelated to this project as part of other efforts in town, there's still an additional 12 feet of public right of way.
The town only has 6 feet, I thought.
Yeah, the roadway layout is a total, the red line, the two red lines, edge to edge, those two lines are 60 feet apart. The roadway itself, the paved width of the roadway is probably somewhere in the order of 22 feet to 23 feet. And then you obviously have a sidewalk on the west side and a curb, but there's still a lot of right of way, town-owned land on either side of the road. That
I'll be interested to see that.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. And again, as I said, these are very early stages in concept, and we will certainly be communicating throughout the process. So, and I apologize that it doesn't appear amongst our panelists that we have anybody from the town who could weigh in on that question about the right of way. So, but I will work to get you an answer to that question.
I would appreciate that.
All right. Any other questions in the forum? Okay. Okay. User named Kestner. Go ahead if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I wrote a question about Chamberlain Street. Are you going to put a light there? Because there's going to be a lot of houses online that are coming from that direction. At the end of our block, there's a big community being built. And I assume at some point, there are going to be a lot of kids coming from that direction.
Yeah, so in the current proposed plans, there's nothing about a signal at Chamberlain, but this project obviously is happening in the context of a lot of things that are going on in town, and that's part of the reason why we really involve the town and public safety in all of these discussions so that we can get a sense of, you know, what the expectations are and what needs might be beyond this project to make sure that we can accommodate all of the students who are going to be going to the school. So I know it's not a straightforward answer. I don't know the answer to the question, but it's certainly something that I think we'll be asking about as we get through the traffic process.
To add to that, John, the proposal does include pedestrian crossings from one side of Hayden Road to the other that would pick up the pedestrians coming from that neighborhood with a push button actuated flasher to stop traffic.
Yeah, but there's going to be cars, people dropping students off. It's not just people walking. So I'm saying there's going to be a lot of cars down Chamberlain Street. It seems going to be the only connection across town from that side of town to the other side of town where the lumber yard is, or whatever the lumber place is, to the school. It's going to be a cut through. People are going to cut through there just to get to the elementary school.
So again, we don't have a clear answer to that. Obviously, the Chamberlain development is something we've taken into account when it comes to school population. As I said, as we're going forward in the discussions of traffic mitigations, we'll look at how many cars we would expect to come down that road and whether putting whether there is further mitigation needed, which could take a number of forms. Traffic light is only one option.
So when developers built the developments in the town of Hopkinton, you didn't propose adding costs to it to mitigate the costs of the people coming into the town to pay for education?
So we're a little bit out of my domain right now because I'm not part of the planning board or the select board. We're charged with this building project. Obviously the property taxes that come in as a part of those new developments are part of what's supposed to help fund the additional services required for those. But in terms of the negotiations with those developers, that would be a question for the planning board or the select board. Our charge as a elementary school building committee is really to deal with the buildings that are necessary for the students that are going to come in. We really don't have any control over the negotiations around those developments.
Shouldn't be in the limits of the taxes that were collected based upon the new people coming in. Shouldn't that be your budget? Not like I'm going to build it and it's going to cost $150 billion and now we're going to have to pay for it somehow.
Okay, so so I'll answer that question, but I am going to move on because we do have a lot of other user questions, and I know that you've asked a few questions here. So you're welcome to reach out separately after this through our email address, esbc2@hopkintonma.gov, and I'd be happy to answer as many questions, but just given the time, I want to make sure everybody else gets an opportunity as well. With respect to the budget, if approved at town meeting, then this will come out of the property taxes of residents of the town. For capital projects such as this, any buildings, it's not part of the regular operating budget tax levy. It is an exemption that the town votes on separately, as we did several times at this town meeting. So that's the mechanics of it. Again, as I said, in terms of the impact of developments and how those are dealt with in the negotiations, I know those are specific to the developers when they're proposing those projects, and that's just not something that I or anyone on this panel has purview over. So as I said, I would direct you to the planning board or the select board when it comes to that. But I do appreciate your questions, but we do need to move on. Okay, let's go through some of the Q&A that was put up there. So a number of the questions have been, we have a few questions that are related to the cost, which I think we've covered what some of the mitigation aspects are that we're trying to do when it comes to cost. The one thing I'll just reiterate is that in some of those cases, unfortunately, much like the MSBA reimbursement, the number that you'll see at town meeting ends up not being the real cost of the project, because the number at town meeting is going to be before reimbursement from the town or reimbursement from the MSBA, and it's going to be before a lot of these rebates we'll get from Mass Save, from the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll clearly illustrate that when we put the entire budget before town, but just be aware that some of the cost mitigations that the committee is engaging in don't come right off of that appropriation. They will be paid back throughout the project. There was a question about, have all current elementary educators been included in project design? As Mrs. Carver and Dr. Kavanaugh outlined, we have been doing a ton of, I say we, our professionals have been doing a ton of forums with the educators at the elementary level to really get their views on the design of this building to make it as effective as possible. You know, at the end of the day, we want this to be the most functional school that it can be. And while we have a great deal of educational experience on this committee, and we're blessed to have that, there is a lot more that we want to tap into. And so those educators are all being consulted in designing the building in which they're going to work. Question about outdoor space, full size, will there be include full size field for sports? There are separate PE fields and recess fields, as you might have seen in the design that Bob showed earlier. The PE fields are kind of equal to almost a soccer field, if I'm not mistaken, in the current design, but there is no intention to have like full-size regulation sports fields on any part of that, because obviously that doesn't support the educational model that you'd have at a second, third, and fourth grade school. Question about reimbursable expenses. It was mentioned that 890 net square foot of need is anticipated as non-reimbursable. What does this equate to in dollars to the town? I hate doing math on the fly, so maybe somebody can help me out, but it's basically.
Yeah, sure. I can do that, John. So there's initial, the MSBA is a process and we go through multiple iterations. So we're in the process of our third submission. It'll come at the conclusion of schematic design. We first submitted the PDP and then the PSR stages. At each of those stages, the MSBA reviews and comments on the ED program, and they advise what they will allow above and beyond their regulations. So as part of the last submission in February, we got feedback on what are some eligible and ineligible square footage items. One of those included a program space that has now been since removed out of the overall project, which was 450 square feet of that overall ineligible number. So that's come down. We're also, the design team is working to finesse some of the others. So that 890 is no longer an accurate number. The simple examples of the library was over by 9 square feet. I mean, the details of the MSBA goes down to is that level of fine tuning. And those are some of the push and pulls the design team has done as they evaluated. The gymnasium, I think, was 115. Again, we're tightening up and shifting these programs to fit within the overall scope. So there will be some level of ineligible square footage. The one element that remains is the book storage room. And so there's a consolidated area where the school has a book storage room that was 450 square feet. So that's the one element that has remained in the program that is necessary to the educational delivery. The MSBA reimbursement to the town of Hopkinton is 44%, I think. And so you take the overall dollars per square foot project, the MSBA multiplies that by the part of the square footage that they would reimburse, and then they multiply that by the ineligible. So essentially it's 25% of the cost is what you would then take on additionally from what you would pay overall. So I know that's a kind of a complicated, long version, but we don't have a final number, so I don't want to give a specific dollar value at this point.
I think that was helpful. Thanks, Jeff. The question about on the schematic design, it looks like the bus flow and the car flow would cause traffic to cross at a point near the first gate and might cause additional congestion because one's going clockwise, one's going counterclockwise. I know that was something that was discussed previously. Jeff or Dan, if you could weigh in on that.
Yep, so the project team is continuing to evaluate both options. Right now, the current proposal is, as you saw it today, provides a lot of benefits with that queue length area. Right now, the buses would split off from the parent drop-off just after the roundabout departure. And then we quickly get the parents in a different lane where the buses then can continue on. So the amount of cross traffic exiting back out is minimal. If we were to reverse it, there are some additional complications with the parking lot and shifts to the overall site plan, but it is something we continue to study. But right now, the current proposal is to not reverse it.
Thank you. A couple of questions related to what happens if this project is not approved, and they come in two flavors. One of them is what's the process if that happens, and then one of them is what is the impact on students and educators. So maybe for the first half, I'll ask Jeff maybe to answer that, and then for the second part, in terms of impact students and educators, Dr. Kavanaugh, if you could take that one.
Sure. And Mrs. Rothermick and I have some slides we can show as well. Super quick.
So the way the MSBA process works is a final solution is developed by the building committee and approved to be submitted and also reviewed in front of the school committee and the select board at the end of this summer. That goes in front of the MSBA board for their approval. Once that's done, that's the package that comes back to the town vote, and it's an up or down vote. So if the town was not to approve the total package, which is the total scope, schedule, and cost of the project, then the project would stop. The MSBA would do an exit survey to understand, what the reasons were, but you would go back to the end of the line. The school and the town would be able to reapply to the MSBA process, but that takes several years to get back into the queue and work things through with the MSBA.
All right. So, John, if I can just share my screen quickly.
Sure.
Okay. All right, so let me just, there we go. All right, so I did want to just show you a couple of slides because we have been talking about what would happen if this were voted down from an MSBA relationship standpoint as well as from a school-based standpoint. One of the things that Mrs. Rothermick and I keep trying to underscore for folks is that this is really an end-of-life replacement. That's how we ended up with a relationship with the MSBA. The SOI that we submitted to the MSBA was submitted as long ago as March of 2020. So I think that it contextually helps people to understand just how long and protracted this process can be. So what we know is that there's a need to accommodate a predicted 775 students in grades 2 and 3, and a need to accommodate a predicted 1,175 students if we were talking about grades 2 to 4. As Mr. D'Amico just said, the reimbursement rate hovers around 25%. And if the project costs $170 million, and we don't know that pricing yet, I think that's been one of the big themes of tonight's presentation. The reimbursement rate then is at $42.5 million. And the school is slated to open somewhere around December of 2027, which lets you know that we still have, time where we're going to have overcrowding in the Elmwood building. I like to show this slide as well because I think it shows you what the MSBA prediction is. The MSBA says that we'll have 775 students in grades 2 to 3. Currently, we have 635 kids there. That is trending ahead of what the MSBA predicted and ahead of what our demographer predicted. If we take a look at grades 2 to 4, again, 1175. Currently in grades 2 to 4, we have 976 students. So we are very close to those numbers already. And I know that there are people who are wondering, will we ever actually attain those predicted enrollment numbers? And the answer, I think, is that we're trending ahead. So when we look at the Elmwood School as it currently exists, the projected enrollment, as I said, was 775. Current enrollment is 635. It's a difference of 140 students. Typically in grades 2-3, we target about 22 students a classroom. So if we had 23, we would have a need for additional 6 classrooms. But what we need to remember, and now we're getting at the answer to what will happen to Elmwood School, is that in addition to those 6 classrooms, we don't have available space at the Elmwood School right now for additional ESOL classes or special education classes, or eventually in the near future, we're going to need more gym space, for example. And the cafeteria, as we all know, is undersized for that particular school, and we're currently running. In addition to classrooms, all of those kinds of, other specialized learning spaces or community spaces would need attention as well. So if there is a no vote at special town meeting, the project and our relationship with the MSBA cease to exist, as Ms. D'Amico has said. If there's a no vote at special town meeting, the town loses the MSBA reimbursement, likely in the range of plus minus $45 million. If there's a no vote at special town meeting in November, as Mr. D'Amico just said, we can submit another SOI to the MSBA, but there is no guarantee of acceptance. What the town should know is the first time we ever submitted an SOI for the Elmwood School was 2007, and we were not invited in until 2021. So that gives you a very good idea of how long that line is and the kinds of argument that you make to actually be accepted into what we sometimes refer to as the pipeline. So Elmwood School has space challenges now. So if we have an additional 140 students, we would need, as I said, 6 classrooms. You could reduce the number of classrooms you need, general education classrooms you need, if you increase class sizes to 25 or 26 or 26 or 27. We could also accommodate those classes through the use of trailers on site. The gymnasium can be converted to, start housing classrooms through the use of temporary walls. We just need to be clear that that would take the Elmwood Gymnasium offline for any community use. Our 4 lunches would certainly have more students compacted into a confined cafeteria space, or we move to 5 lunches and we have fewer meal options. And when we say fewer meal options, we mean that because it currently takes X amount of time for kids to go through the 2 cafeteria lines. If you have more kids going through those lines, you're going to have to eliminate some of the choices that they have and just really hand kids a lunch to move them through kind of expeditiously. Right now, there's a lot of choice and kids are slowed down by making those choices. The gym class scheduling for 36 classrooms would require the school to either create much larger gym class sections, physical education sections, have those classes outdoors, or hold some PE classes in general education classrooms. Other related arts classes would also have to, expand in size and then move to gen ed classrooms. Special education classes would require education in either the trailers, or if we emptied gen ed classrooms and we subdivided them, they could be used for small group instruction, but then those gen ed students would need to be moved either to the gym or to trailer space. And obviously traffic would increase on Elm Street and Wood Street, and we would need more buses to transport more students because you wouldn't have the one-stop shopping you would on Hayden Row. So we would have to contract with more with Conley for more buses. It's about $75,000 per bus. I would like for people to bear in mind that the Elmwood project is in fact connected to the district expansion plan for Hopkins, the middle school and the high school. So while this seems like one project that we've been focused on, we need to remember that there could be in fact a domino effect moving upward. This is a slide here that we've had for a very long time. You can see our current enrollment. And even though the current enrollment, it says at the top right-hand corner is 4,173 students, we are actually over 4,200 right now. So that really speaks to how we are tracking with more students than was ever predicted by the MSBA or our demographer. The projected enrollment by the year 2032 is 5,097 students, an increase of about 22% of our current population. So what you see happening here is if we kept our current configuration, a pre-K to 1 school, a 2-3, a 4-5, you can see that the 626 that we currently have, which is actually a little bit more than that right now, would need to be designed for 774. So what you're talking about is an increase of the 148 or 140 students I just described. You're not going to fit those kids into the current Elmwood. It's just not going to happen. The same thing is true for Hopkins. We currently have over 640 students in that building. If we reach that projected enrollment, we're never going to be able to accommodate another 162 kids at the current Hopkins school. So you're going to have the same problem at Hopkins, or you're going to have to follow through with the Hopkins expansion project that we have been currently talking about with townspeople and at annual town meeting. One of the things that we look at is if you build a 2-3-4 school and you have a 5-6 school here for Hopkins with 803 kids in it, and you'd still have to enlarge Hopkins, what you've done effectively is you've reduced the population in the middle school from the 977 we have today to 795. That's going to be able to allow us to take some of these students here from the high school, which is almost 1,500. So when we look at this number of high school, middle school kids, that's 2,210 students. Here we're talking about 2,293 students. It's only a difference of about 80 kids. We would have to alter these buildings and connect them, but the accommodating number, and I know that we'd have to think about programs and how we would move grade 9 over to the middle school building and still be able to make them feel like freshmen and part of a high school. But really, when you're talking about 83 kids, the construction is far less in this area right here. And I think we saw tonight that when you're talking about high school space, it can be more per square foot just because of the needs. So these are some of our thinking around, what happens if it doesn't pass. I am sorry to take up so much time with that, but I felt like it was really important for us to do. And I don't know, Mrs. Rothermick, if you wanted to add anything. I went through those super quickly.
So what I would say is we're going to be talking about this more at subsequent elementary school building committee meetings, I think as soon as Tuesday. I just want to say, in the interest of time, maybe we'll put a cap on that question there, but there's certainly more to come on that specific topic. I know it is 8:04, and so I want to thank people who have hung in with us. What I will say is that we will, as this is being recorded, we're going to answer all of the questions that are in the Q&A, no matter how long we have to go here, just so that we make sure that all of your questions are addressed. We do have one additional live question that's up right now. Mike Manning, you are, if you can unmute yourself, feel free to ask your question.
Hi, John. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So tonight, I'm here as a resident of Hopkinton. And as some of you have known, I've been personally involved with the Elmwood School replacement probably for close to 10 years when we began our effort to get an invitation by MSBA. So I do believe that it's important to get this new school built. But I have also been following the ESBC2 process since the beginning and appreciate the efforts of all the committee members. But I do, I know it's been a common theme, but I do have a major concern as we move forward, and it's potential $170 million cost of construction. When I talk to other residents in Hopkinton, they're blown away by the tax impact that this will have with the school, and this project alone can cost, $1,500 per year or more per household. So my observation is that the cost evaluation when we're doing this is not taking a high enough priority. And I think the goal is to build a replacement school for the Elmwood School, but it comes across that we want to build, I know, Barbie, I call it Barbie's dream house. I know Superintendent called it Taj Mahal, but I think we really have to be really careful of the costs. And, I was following the example of when we're making the decision on the HVAC system. So that was pretty much the first decision that had to be made on a financial basis. And, when I was going through, looking over, the slides that were available, the taxpayer cost was not high on the list. It should have had a much higher priority. I know it's all important for sustainability and the net zero, the net Hopkinton being at net zero, but it was a non-binding article that passed the town meeting. So it's not the sole reason for making decisions. And, as I was going through, this, I saw, you're showing the slides that show it is the most efficient to go with the method you have chose, the option. But I was looking to see what were the assumptions that were used to show those data points. I really think it needs to go into much more detail. Also, when evaluating the costs, and John, you did talk about how it's more complicated when we go for the appropriation. And I'm thinking the same thing. For example, we have to borrow that additional $7 million that it'll cost for the choice up front. That's the upfront cost. So what is the debt service on that? Was that taken into account? I don't know, because I don't know what the assumptions are on the data. And the rebates that are available, the mass save, yeah, there's a good chance we'll get that, but the more federal ones or the higher one, that who knows what will happen down the road. So can we really count on that? But we do have to appropriate and borrow the full amount. So I have a lot of concern on that I'm looking at every piece of the cost, and this was the first decision that was made. And I just have a lot more questions on that before the final decision is made. And I realize there are 13 members on the ESBC2 committee. Looking at the list, we have one representative from appropriations, and maybe there's 3 or 4 members who really have the financial objectivity. But I think that's really important going forward. But what I would like to see is I really would like to see cost as the major initiative in this, because I would like to see when we get to the point of going to town meeting that everybody is on board and we already know that this is going to pass and not have like we had with the previous, the marathon or the marathon school where, we had to start at the drawing board again because when we got to town meeting, there was a lot of dissension on the decisions that were made. I'd like to make sure that we know we have full town approval on this, or I guess we'll never really know, but we really want to have consensus because it is about educating the kids and moving forward, and just want to make sure that we're aware of that and keep that front and center. So I just wanted to make those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I do appreciate that. I would encourage everyone to really also look at to look at some of the conversations that we have had around this. And because cost is a significant factor that everyone on the committee is taking into account. Every voting member of the committee is a taxpayer in Hopkinton. We have a lot of other members who are professional staff, but all of the voting members are taxpayers in Hopkinton. And we, I think, had similar reactions to some of the initial cost estimates and are spending a lot of time really pushing hard against the designers and the engineers and the project managers and the staff to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible when it comes to the cost. The reality is, and I agree, we've got a lot of more education to do once this final budget is done. As we looked at the various options that were before us in order to solve this problem, including a renovation of the existing building, there were none available that were significantly less expensive. And so what we're trying to do is make the decisions within the parameters that we have to try to keep that cost as under control as possible. I would note when it comes to the HVAC systems, you're right, there's a fair amount, not a fair amount, but there are some things that we don't know exactly. So for instance, when do those rebates come in? I'm not sure we'd have to borrow against that or the rebates would come in time. These are things that we'll need to clarify before town meeting. But I would note that in the decision around the HVAC system, the committee took a very specific vote to go forward with the full geothermal system, but leave the alternative system, which has less upfront cost, in as a consideration for future value engineering going forward. So that if we see that is just something we simply can't afford in the project going forward to get support at town meeting, we have an alternative. So those are definitely considerations that are remaining front and center. And I think actually there were a lot of questions that came in around the size of the cost, around all of those pieces. So I think I answered a bunch of them in response to Mike's question, but I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I think you did. I think the other cost one that's in there is the tax impact.
Yeah.
There's not a detailed tax analysis yet for the reasons discussed today on both sides here. It's a moving target in terms of the total cost of the project, the actual reimbursement value. As the prior comments are made, Mass Save is guaranteed money in terms of that program is tried and true and a long track record. That's a couple of $1 million. But then there's another larger $7 million potentially coming back from the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. That comes after post-occupancy. So in terms of the borrowing, there would be a band borrowing likely with the town. So a short-term borrowing up front and then a long-term borrowing. Those of you that have taken out loans recently know that the rates are very high. right? And so there's benefits in this current market to go with the short term versus long term, where in other markets, the long term right up front. Other towns have borrowed all the money just because the rates were very low. So working that through with the town finance leadership is something we're going to do this fall to get more specific numbers and answer all those questions once we have a defined number.
Yep, thank you. Okay, a couple of more logistical kind of site questions. Will there be a cut through between the schools marathon and the new Elmwood that will allow parents with children both easy access, pick up and drop off? Essentially, so you don't have to go into Marathon, come out, go into New Elmwood, come out. And I believe the answer to that is yes. From a traffic flow perspective, there is a road connecting the two, and it will allow drop off to be done in, drop off as many kids as you have to drop off, and go out the other way. This probably came in before we got to some of the design presentations, but there was a question about shared entrance. There will be two separate entrances for the two schools. We will have a new driveway for the new Elmwood School, but the ability to connect the two so that they can go through. The question about this is sort of related to the building, the cost of building, and if there are options even within the educational model, referencing back to the days of hybrid education, using Zoom to maybe mitigate the amount of space we need to build for students. The only thing I'll say about that is that without even debating the efficacy of that model, currently there is no state regulation that allows us to do anything other than educate these children inside a building every day. So that is what we're tasked with building. We don't have the school district doesn't have the purview to come up with an alternative at this point. Did the decision to keep students in one wing for 3 years impact the building design, or was that strictly an educational or operational decision? And then a question about at which meeting was that discussed? And second one, I'm pretty sure that was one of the working group meetings. I don't think that's come up at a ESBC meeting yet, but maybe somebody could, well, actually, I'll ask somebody else to answer that, but just know that that is not a physical permanent design decision. Once the building is opened in the future at any time, the educational model could drive a change to that.
Yeah, Dr. Kavanaugh could take that as well, but to John's point, nothing binds the project. Right now, it was just one way to slice the building, right? You could put all the grades in a vertical. One wing could be all second grade, one wing, all third, one wing, all fourth. Or as was discussed tonight, the lower level is the second floor, the middle is the third, and then the fourth grade is on the upper floor. And that's the current basis suggested, but that did not influence the overall design. We did look at longer wings early on with the building committee, because I know there are some other questions in the chat about squaring off the building and, you know, being more efficient in those terms of layout. We evaluated the longer runs, the walk for students, the congestion in the hallways, and the building committee opted for the 3-wing approach versus the 2-wing approach. Returning one of the wings at the end of the building would kind of get more of the barbell was implied there, but there would be some savings in the exterior envelope, but not dramatically different in the overall size of the building. And so it would be purely an envelope reduction in one end of the wing. Carol, if you want to add anything else to that or not?
No, I think just in terms of that community as well, you know, educationally and social emotionally, we liked the idea of being able to keep a school adjustment counselor in a wing so that kids would have the same school adjustment counselor, the same assistant principal over a 3-year period. One of the constraints, I think, of our current configuration is that, you know, school adjustment counselor has a kid for 1 year or 2 years, or an assistant principal has them for 2 years. So it would really be nice to get to know children and families in a much sort of deeper kind of relationship.
And I'd also add to that, Carol, that the original idea of would it be possible to house students in a smaller neighborhood feel came from teachers. There were teachers at Elmwood School that felt like it would be really wonderful if 6 teachers could promote their students to 6 teachers versus when you're one member of a 15-person team, for example, and you're sending all of your students to 15 classrooms, then you might be matching 2 kids at a time. So that idea was presented to Carol and I from teachers.
Thank you. We had a question if there has been a drainage plan created and shared for this project, given some of the worsening groundwater issues that are being experienced by the neighborhood behind. And I will confess, I don't actually know where we are at that point in the process. So maybe.
So I can take that one, John.
Yeah, thank you.
So the ESBC recently approved the first step in really being able to understand how to solve that problem. Which is to do soil test pits. We had a licensed soil evaluator do 3 test pits earlier this week. And that allowed them to collect the information that the design team will need to develop that plan. As part of that plan, the project will need to meet all state stormwater requirements. And so that's an important first step to sort of know the facts that you're dealing with so that the design team can develop a solution. One thing that will probably help in that regard is that there's been a concerted effort to limit paved areas and try and reduce paved areas. So that reduction is going to have less water that sheets off the new construction and will be contained and absorbed into the ground. And so we expect that more will be coming in that regard as the civil engineer analyzes the data that was gathered earlier this week and develops that plan.
One more thing to add, the project will go through planning board approval in town. So even after the town meeting vote, there's still a lot of design left to do. The vote at town meeting, the design is only 30% complete. That locks in the overall size of the building, the scope of the building, the program of the building, but the details, the actual design details, the envelope details, that continues on and makes its way through the various boards in town, including Concom, Planning Board, and all other purviewed boards. And that'll look at all aspects of the project. So this project will go through multiple iterations through those boards.
So there were a couple more questions. I think we just have a few left. I do just want to check, Mike Manning, your hand is raised. Did you leave it raised or do you have another question? Because I'll invite you back in if. Oh, okay, good. So a couple questions about the design of the building and why we chose 3-story versus a taller building that might be more efficient, or why we chose the wings as opposed to a box structure that presumably might be more efficient. Again, while efficiency of cost and design is critical, we also need to consider things like making sure that all the classrooms have outdoor light access. So creating kind of a rectangular building would put some of those classrooms in the middle. If you made it too long, the kids have way too far to walk to get to the gym and the cafeteria. So we have to make those considerations. And in terms of the stories, there are restrictions in town with respect to how tall we can make a building. Obviously, the 3-story building is going to be pretty tall as compared to other buildings within town as it is. So going above that would create real design problems given the bylaws in town. And then several questions that were a little bit like that hybrid learning question. If you have questions about the educational model in terms of what we can do around enrollment, et cetera, I'm not trying to skirt your questions. We're just not the right committee to answer them. So I would encourage you to point those questions towards the school committee or the school district. And then several points in the Q&A about 2 things. One, lowering the cost and making sure that there is a really extensive understanding of the costs, including operational costs, impact to annual town budgets, as well as those down the road savings and rebates that will come in as part of this that might not be in the appropriation. And so if there's a last thing for me to say in this Q&A section, it is that on behalf of the Elementary School Building Committee, we really hear you. We are doing everything we can to manage the cost of this project while still making sure that we're going to build a building that can effectively educate our students, not just in 2027 when it opens, but for the building's going to have a useful life of 50 years. So we want to make sure that we build the building that is up to the standards of Hopkinton's education while taking into consideration the escalating costs that it is putting on the taxpayers. And we will do everything we can between now and November's town meeting to make sure that there is ample information in the community about where those costs are coming from, what they're going towards, what we decided not to do to make sure that we could keep those costs under control, and how that is all going to break down when it comes to borrowing and tax impact. And if we're not doing that to your satisfaction, please hold us accountable. We can be reached at our email address is esbc2@hopkintonma.gov. We will continue to have these forums as frequently, if not more frequently, as we approach, as we go through these decisions in the summer. But please also attend our meetings, watch them on HCAM. They are all recorded on HCAM as well, so you can really keep up with how we're making these decisions. If no one else on the panel has anything, then I would just say I really appreciate not only the turnout for this forum, but the engagement. These questions and comments are critical. We are but a small committee, especially when it comes to Hopkinton residents that are trying to represent the taxpayers and students as best we can. And so your feedback and questions will continue to be critical in helping us shape the solution that we're going to bring forward to November's town meeting. So I want to thank all of our presenters tonight, and I especially want to thank the residents who joined and asked us those questions and provided commentary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.